Good evening, everybody. For those of you, obviously, we've prayed for Charlie Kirk and his family. For those of you who did not see, Charlie was doing what he always does, which is engaging in the free speech debate on college campuses, trying to win minds, not only to the conservative movement, but to Christ through his words. And he was shot and died a little while later. I think his family was there. Charlie is a friend of this church. We always, sometimes we have technical difficulties on Sunday mornings, as you all know. And or even on Wednesday nights. And one of the things that we've had queued up is actually a Charlie Kirk video of him complimenting this church and saying and complimenting the work that this church does across the country, and not just generally this church, but this church specifically, you all, and our pastor by name, because of what we're doing. He was a good friend of this church. He was a good friend of our pastor. I know that he had, because I saw the text messages, but talked about our pastor being one of his mentors. This is a really sad day. And one of the things that I think is, and I'm going to get to the lesson here in just a moment, but one of the things that I was reflecting on and looking at with Charlie was just a few days ago. He tweeted, because this is just the person that he was, is no matter what, he was always talking about his faith, and he sent out to his millions and millions of followers and all the people who hated him. He said, "Jesus defeated death so that you can live." And what's cool is that in a moment this afternoon, as Charlie went to heaven, he was able to say what that promise is in the Bible, but he was able to say real time, "Oh death, where is your sting?" And what's so cool is that one day when Christ returns and all of our bodies are resurrected, we will all say with Charlie, "Oh death, where is your victory?" Now, what's going to be very important after moments like this, because this is kind of one of those, it feels like one of those tipping point moments or turning moments in the country. Now, I wasn't alive in the 70s, but I know that there were a lot of political violence in the 70s. But there's always that moment where things kind of correct. And what's so important in a time like this is the need for a prophetic vision. Proverbs 29:18 says, "Where there is no prophetic vision, the people perish." So be keeping our pastor in your prayers, because this Sunday will be I don't know for sure what he's going to be talking about, but I know that it will probably be related to some of the events that have been taking place recently. And it is so important that we continue this effort in the face of great evil to be that prophetic vision across the country, because so many people are silent. This is why this church does what it does, because it's needed. Because the question is when someone like a Charlie Kirk's no longer with us, is what do we do next? Who's next? Well, the church has got to still be that prophetic voice, because what we need more than anything right now is national repentance. That's the only thing that will heal this country, is national repentance. I was reminded this morning, or this afternoon anyway, of John 18:2, and it says, and Jesus is speaking, and it says, "A time is coming when everyone who kills you will believe they are offering service to God." And I will say this: there is no one on earth who is more cruel or inhumane than those convinced that they are fighting for a righteous cause. Because when you think you are fighting for a righteous cause, there is nothing in your the back of your mind or in your conscience, because it's been so seared, so that will stop you or prompt you to stop doing evil. That's what we're seeing right now. What we're going to talk about tonight is another version of that. Anyways, close all of that out. Keep the Kirk family in your prayers. Keep this church in your prayers. Keep our pastor in your prayers. Keep all of those who are speaking for truth in your prayers. And keep, obviously, like your family. Again, I was thinking of, the videos of his 3-year-old girl and his 1-year-old boy after today. Never go to bed angry with your spouse or with your family. Never leave the house without giving them a hug and a kiss and telling them you love them. because you never know if that's going to be the last one. So, anyways, with that, as you all know, over the last couple of weeks, we've been, working on worldview training. Specifically, we've been studying Islam. In weeks 1 and 2, we looked at the history and the religion of Islam. Tonight, we're going to talk about the wars of Islam. And I hope tonight you're going to learn, I think you're going to learn a lot about some Christian heroes of the faith that you have never heard about before. And I hope that in light of what has happened today, in your minds, you look at the bravery and fearlessness in the face of pure evil that some of these Christian heroes had, and it encourages you. Because quite frankly, what I hope that, obviously what I hope that we learn tonight a lot, but I also hope that the takeaway is that you can be brave in the face of fear, because our God is bigger than anything on this earth, and especially our adversary, the devil. We're going to cover 1,700 years of human history, and I want to make a couple of disclaimers. As we talk about history, there will be some very appalling details that we will learn about. But those events do not change the truth about Jesus' love for others. Remember that Islam is a socio-political system that we reject. Muslims, however, are individuals who need Jesus, and Jesus loves them and wants them to get saved, and so we should too. I also want to note a couple of things that when I'm describing some of these wars between Islam and the West, I will use terms like West and Christian and Christendom to define nations, lands, and peoples who self-identified as Christians. This will include Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, and now we're not going to spend time arguing whether or not these folks were actually Christian. Some were not, but we're not focused on their theology. What we're trying to do is simply understand the history, because much to our modern ignorance, the wars of Islam in the West are a primary shaper of our modern world. Further, you cannot fully comprehend or understand what Islam is and what is happening right now in the world unless you understand its 1,400 years of conquest. For example, in France, there was a son of an imam and 2 others who were arrested were a terrorist plot. They were trying to blow some folks up. And their motivation, they were trying to avenge the Muslim troops defeated by Charles Martel in the year 732 AD. Now, most of us have no idea who that person even is or what that battle even is. But this was the primary motivation of this imam's son. Well, why? Well, it's because Islam walks in perfect continuity with its history, and the West has absolutely no idea what its history is. But as the philosopher George Santayana famously said, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So with that, let's jump in. The modern understanding of history is pretty easy. We know Rome existed and there were some crusades, or basically we're pretty ignorant on our modern history. So we know Rome existed and that there were some crusades at some point, and there's this thing called the Dark Ages, and then all of a sudden, like 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and then we really don't have any idea what happened between really about the time of Christ and the Declaration of Independence. What we miss, especially in those dark ages, is the shaping of Europe amidst the great defense of Christendom from a tidal wave of Islamic aggression. So let's learn about it together. Jesus dies in 33 AD, and Christianity begins to spread and find specific success in the Roman Empire, even under immense persecution by the Roman Caesars. As a minority and persecuted religion, it thrives on this message of grace and love and proclaiming the good news of Jesus. In 312, Constantine was campaigning to consolidate power as emperor of Rome against his rival Maxentius. And before a pivotal battle known as the Battle of Milvian Bridge, Constantine had a vision. He stated he saw in the sky a sign of the cross with the words, "In this sign you will conquer." Constantine then, before the battle, writes the Christian monogram Chi Rho on all of his soldier seals, which represented Christ. And Constantine, subsequently, was victorious in that battle. He then converted to Christianity, and then the following year, in 313 AD, he issues the Edict of Milan, which legalizes Christianity, allowing Christians to openly practice their faith across the open empire. Constantine then moves his throne east from Rome over here to Constantinople, or what at that time was known as this little bitty town called Byzantium that he then fortified, and it became the great mighty city of the Eastern Roman Empire called Constantinople. During this time, Constantine's mother, Helena, visits Jerusalem and is said to have discovered the true cross, which was supposedly the cross that Jesus died on. Then, under Constantine's direction, he builds churches across the Holy Land, specifically on top of the place where supposedly Jesus had died and rose again, and it was called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, over the next 300 years, Western Rome waned, but the mantle of Roman leadership in the West was filled by the Bishop of Rome that we know as the Pope. And the church in Rome began significantly expanding its political and spiritual influence. By 600 AD, the map looks something like this, with the Eastern Roman Empire still very, very strong, and it's battling against the Persian Empire in the east. And what I want to make note at this point is that all of this land is predominantly Christian. Now, meanwhile, down here in Arabia, there are no real empires. They're just a bunch of warring tribes. Enter Muhammad into a town called Mecca. Now, we spoke about this in week 1, but a quick summary. Muhammad had a vision that he was visited by Gabriel, and that he was the great prophet of Allah. He goes to the Jews, he goes to the Christians, he goes to his own tribe, the Quraysh tribe in Mecca, and says, "I'm the great prophet," and they all said, "No, you're not." After a decade of peaceful preaching, he had about 100 followers. He's eventually run out of Mecca and has to go north to a town called Medina, and it was what it called the Hijra. During this time, he brokers a peace treaty between 2 of the warring tribes, and he becomes the master of the city with a considerable force. It was at this time that Muhammad begins to raid, and his message changes from a message of peace to convert to Islam or die. To attract troops, he would reward the soldiers of Islam with 80% of the spoils of war and all of the sex slaves that they could possibly get their hands on. To validate this claim, I provided roughly 25 verses from the Quran. Muhammad's change from peace to conquest worked, as he amassed an army of tens of thousands within 10 years and conquered all of Arabia. It was during this decade that Muhammad launched an average of 9 military campaigns annually, and it was during this time that Muhammad conquered the Jewish clan of the Banu Qurayza, and it beheaded 600 of their men in a day, setting the beheading precedent that we see throughout the rest of history. Now, I want to focus on one of the more important battles and events for Muhammad's life, and that is the conquering of Mecca. See, during the conquest of Arabia, Muhammad took about 2,700 soldiers down to Mecca to conquer it, and they fought to a stalemate. As a result, Muhammad entered into a 10-year peace treaty called the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. After 2 years of that treaty, Muhammad had more success gathering more soldiers, and he had amassed a force of about 10,000 men, and he broke the Hudaybiyah Treaty and marched to Mecca and gave Mecca the ultimatum, submit or lose your head. Now, this is important to note because jihadists still point to this event as an example to be followed. Remember, in Islam, Muhammad is the perfect Muslim and his life should be emulated. So, for example, in 1994, Yasser Arafat agreed to the Oslo Accords with Israel, and he received much grief from Muslims from around the world. And in defense of this decision, he said, "Remember Hudaybiyah," and to make this point that Islam was deceiving the Israelis. In Islam, this is known as the taqiyya, which is a rule under Islamic law that you are allowed to lie and deceive your enemies as long as it'll help you conquer them later. Now, I want to briefly make a point here about why Muhammad was so successful in Arabia. As we discussed in the first week, Muhammad was illiterate, and so his message was a synchronization of what he had been taught in his life. At the core was Arabian tribalism. So the appeal of Muhammad's message lay in its compatibility with the tribal mores of Arabia. Specifically, 3 key items: loyalty to one's tribe, enmity for other tribes, and raids on the latter to enrich and empower the former. So if you were in the tribe, you're treated humanely, and if you're outside the tribe, you are little more than an animal. So Muhammad creates this super tribe that's called the Ummah, and it transcends racial, national, and linguistic barriers. And thus the jihad was born. And it was one tribe against another, the Islamic Ummah in one tent and the tribes of the infidels in the other. The two tribes are labeled Dar al-Islam, or the abode of Islam, and Dar al-Kufr, or the abode of infidelity, also called Dar al-Harb, which is the tribe of war. Now, so to summarize, Muhammad deified 7th century Arabian tribalism, causing it to outlive its sunsetting and the rest of the modern world. Now, what made Islam so dangerous and so much more effective than tribalism was that Muhammad provided tribal raiding or jihad with a win-win outcome. You see, typical tribalism was subject to this, well, if your side won, well, then you got to keep the spoils of war, but there was always the threat that if you died, well, you died. But Muhammad deified the raid. And numerous verses in the Quran and Hadith outline jihad as the most noble of behaviors. For example, Muhammad said that lining up for battle in the path of Allah is worthier than 60 years of worship. Further, he said if one died during jihad, that they were guaranteed paradise with virgins created by Allah for the express purpose of gratifying his favorite martyrs for eternity. Further, the martyrs would be given good food, gold, drink, and served by eternally young boys, and that will circulate amongst the believers. All of those verses are right there. So this win-win offer of keep whatever you want, and if you conquer, and if you die, you go to paradise and get even more, is described perfectly in Surah 9, 111. Well, after Muhammad had taken Arabia, he turned his eyes to Christendom. And it was this time that you see the Quran specifically direct its animus towards Jews and Christians. We see this vitriol towards Christians in Muhammad's hatred of the Christian symbol, specifically of the cross, which he would break when he would see it. Muhammad even says has recorded in some of the hadiths that when Jesus returns on Judgment Day, one of his chief missions will be to break the cross and kill the pigs. I leave it to you to determine who the pigs are. And it's this mindset that we still see Islamists use today as they desire to destroy the cross. For example, we've seen across Canada 113 churches burned to the ground. Just last week in the UK in Essex, we see Muslims tearing crosses down for the sole purpose off of churches for the sole purpose of just destroying them. All right, so Muhammad has fixed his eyes on Christendom, and he sends a letter to the Roman emperor with the heart of the letter containing these two Arabic words, Aslam Taslam, or submit to Islam and have peace. It was rejected, and Muhammad responded by sending 3,000 Muslims into Christian territory chanting victory or martyrdom, but they were defeated. The following year, Muhammad declared eternal war on Christianity as captured extensively in Surah chapter 9 of the Quran. Now, the crown jewel of Muhammad's desire was to conquer the Roman capital of Constantinople. Muhammad prophesied, "Surely Constantinople will be conquered by my community. How blessed the commander who will conquer it, and how blessed his army." Then in 632, Muhammad died, and he was succeeded by his father-in-law, Abu Bakr. And this kicked off the apostasy wars of Islam, which is many of the tribes that had followed Muhammad decided they wanted to break away. They didn't want to have anything to do with Islam. But under Islamic law, apostasy warrants death. And Abu Bakr enforced this apostasy law with swift vengeance. Now, this is important to know because Islam would have ended right here had it not been for their apostasy laws. Remember, with words alone, Muhammad was not very persuasive. He only had about 100 followers. But with a sword, it's very persuasive. So Islam has to have its sword. So when we evangelize, or we hear of someone who is converted from Islam to Christianity, realize the amount of extra support that person needs and the amount of love that they need. All right, by 634, the Islamic Empire was now unified under one banner, and they had set out to conquer. Now, the first major battle between the West and the Islamic Caliphate happened at Yarmouk, and it was in 636 AD. See, after Islam had conquered Damascus, again, where the Apostle Paul was converted, in 635, the Roman Emperor Heraclius led a large army to stop the Islamic invaders that were being led by Khalid al-Walid, who was known as the Sword of Islam. Now, prior to this battle, the Christian general met with the Sword of Islam, and the Christian general said, as recorded by both Christian and Islamic sources, that he understood it was Arabia's harsh climate and conditions that gave the Arabs the no choice but to raid Roman lands. And so the Christian general offered them food and water and supplies to go home and return in peace. There was no need for war. To this, the Sword of Islam responded, "It is neither hunger nor poverty that has driven us from our land. We are drinkers of blood, and we know there is no blood more tasty than that of the Greeks. That is why we have come to spill and drink your blood." Now, I want you to recall in 2015, when ISIS was wreaking havoc and everyone was trying to understand what motivated them, one ISIS member said, "American blood is best, and we will taste it soon." We in the West could not comprehend that statement, but they were quoting the Sword of Islam from this Battle of Yarmouk. You must understand, in Islam, it is one continuous history. They emulate their heroes. Further, when you see the UN and all of our brilliant people in academia come out with some statement like, well, climate change is leading to terrorism, recognize that this has been offered 1400 years ago, and it was specifically rejected by the Muslims then. It is specifically rejected now. Climate change is not causing terrorism. Well, the Battle of Yarmouk commences, and the Muslims defeated the Romans. And I will tell you one quick story of Christian bravery from this battle. So at the end of the battle, there were about 60 Christian knights who fought and held on one final stronghold in the area of Gaza against the entire Muslim army. They were obviously eventually captured, and the Islamic generals were so impressed by these Christians' ability to fight that they told them if they would just submit to Islam, they would free them and give them back their wives and their children and their treasures, and they could actually join the Islamic army. But if they rejected it, they would die. Well, these Christian warriors responded with the following. They said, "No one can separate us from the love of Christ, neither wives nor sons, nor all the wealth of this world. But we are servants of Christ, the Son of the living God, and we are prepared to die for him who died and rose for us." They were then tortured to death. Now, this battle is considered one of the most consequential in history. If the Eastern Roman Empire would have been victorious here, then Islam would likely have ended right there. Instead, the floodgates were open, and the Islamic Empire proceeded to conquer Antioch, where the believers were first called Christians, and they conquered Jerusalem less than a year later. The Muslims then spread into Egypt, conquering Alexandria and burning the great library there. Caliph Omar, the leader of the empire, said, when he was asked what to do with all of these books in the great library, he said, "If they agree with our book, the Quran, we do not need them, and if they disagree, we do not want them." It is said that the fires and the burning of this library lasted for 6 months. It was this great loss of knowledge and wealth that kicked off what we know as the Dark Ages. And how much more of our history would we know if Alexandria would not have fallen? But realize that freedom of speech and diversity of thought are incompatible with this worldview. Well, the caliphate continued to spread west, conquering all of North Africa, which again was originally Christian lands, and as they went, they murdered and enslaved Christians. An eyewitness of these events, John of Nikiu, who was the bishop of the Nile Delta, describes the atrocities as this. He says, "Whoever surrendered to the Muslims was slaughtered, and no mercy was shown to the elderly, the women, or the children. The Muslims then plundered the possessions of the fleeing Christians, deeming the servants of Christ as enemies of Allah." His chronicles are also riddled with bloodshed that John basically often ends. Most of his entries in these chronicles are basically just, "But let us say no more, for it is impossible to describe the horrors the Muslims committed." At this point, 2/3 of Christendom's original territory had been conquered, and 3 of the 5 most important cities, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria, were gone forever. Now, many have wondered, how did Islam spread so quickly? And I believe a primary driver of this was terrorism, which the West had not yet had to deal with. The Chronicle of 754 of this time states that the Saracens, influenced by their leader Muhammad, conquered and devastated Syria, Arabia, and Mesopotamia more by stealth than by manliness, but not so much by open invasions as by persisting in stealthy raids. Thus, with cleverness and deceit and not by manliness, they attacked all of the adjacent cities of the empire. Remember Muhammad's boast, "I have been made victorious with terror." So recognize that terrorism is a weapon used to make you submit. But as we're going to discuss, as we see the West fight back, you must be brave. Christian, when you see all of the things that are so frightening in this world, you must not be afraid. Remember, God tells us to be courageous, to be fearless, because he will never leave us nor forsake us. By 711, the first Islamic conquest or army crosses the Strait of Gibraltar, and by 720, all of Spain was basically conquered except for this little mountain range up here in the northwest corner. Now, here it was that Pelagius of Asturias, better known as Pelayo, and a small group of Christian Spaniards did not submit to the Islamic forces, known as the Moors. Pelayo and his people held up in the hollows of the Asturian mountains and established the last little bit of free Christian Spain. Well, the Moors knew where he was, and they came and told Pelayo to submit to Islam and all would be well with him. But Pelayo's response was powerful, and I want to read it to you. It says, he said, in the face of a massive army while he's held up in a cave, "I will not associate with the Moors in friendship, nor will I submit to their authority. Have you not read in the divine scriptures that the church of God is compared to a mustard seed, and that it will be raised up again through divine mercy? Christ is our hope that through this little mountain which you see, the well-being of Spain and the army of the Gothic people will be restored. Now, therefore, trusting in the mercy of Jesus Christ, I despise this multitude and am not afraid of it. As for the battle with which you threaten us, we have for ourselves an advocate in the presence of the Father, that is the Lord Jesus Christ, who is capable of liberating us from these few." Then, at the cave of Cavanaga, a battle commenced in the summer of 722, and these last few Christians fought against the vastly and superiorly numbered Muslims, or Moors, and routed them in the mountain ranges of the Spain. And thus, what is known as the Reconquista is born. And as a little mustard seed starting off in a mountain cave, the seed continued to grow and would continue to fight for 8 centuries until the Moors were finally driven out of Spain. This reconquest was completed under the grand vision of monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492 as they liberated Granada. And no sooner was Granada freed that Ferdinand and Isabella funded the voyage of Christopher Columbus in an effort to launch a final and definite crusade against Islam by way of the Indies. The thought was that the East and the West could crush Islam between them. This comes out in Columbus's own letters. In one, he refers to Ferdinand and Isabella as enemies of the wretched sect of Muhammad, who are resolved to send me to the region of the Indies to see how the people thereof can help in the war effort. In another letter written to the monarchs after he had reached the New World, Columbus raised an army. Columbus suggested that he could raise an army to help for the conquest, or for the war and the conquest of Jerusalem. You see, Columbus believed that all people needed to come to know Christ in order for Jesus to return. So he was originally bent on that mission. But before that Spanish Reconquista that we just talked about happened, you must know about the Battle of Tours, which took place in France. Now, after marching through Spain, this is again about the year 700, the Islamic army had made its way all the way to the middle of France. They had conquered southern France and destroyed many, many churches, and brutally murdering priests as they went and sending thousands of slaves back to Damascus. That is, until Charles, the leader of the Franks, led some 30,000 Franks to Tours, France to meet the Islamic forces. Now, the Islamic forces outnumbered the Franks, and they were predominantly cavalry, whereas the French army were heavily armored infantry. Now, the Muslim military tactic was to use their speed on their horses and ride through enemy lines and cut and then run away. Well, and this had been incredibly effective, obviously, by the fact that they had gone from Arabia all the way into France in less than 100 years. But it was not so effective against the French. A chronicler of the battle described it as this in the Frank bravery. He said, "Then the men of the north stood as motionless as a wall. They were like a belt of ice frozen together and not to be dissolved as they slew the Arab with the sword. The Franks, vast of limb and iron of hand, hewed on bravely in the thick of the fight." At one point in the battle, it is said that Allah's warriors surrounded and actually trapped Charles Martel, who was known as the Hammer, but he fought as fiercely as a hungry wolf upon the stag, and by the grace of our Lord, he wrought a great slaughter upon the enemies of the Christian faith. And then he was first called the Martel, which again means hammer, for as a hammer of iron and of steel and every other metal, even so he dashed and smote in the battle all his enemies. The battle was such a decisive victory for the Christians that a Muslim chronicler described it as a pavement of martyrs, as the number of casualties was so lopsided. Charles Martel and his heirs would continue to drive the caliphate out from Europe, specifically his grandson, known as Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, who was crowned as the first Holy Roman Emperor, to lead a united Western front against an ever-pressing jihad. Now, I want to note here, from Charlemagne to Columbus, so much of our Western history that we know little snippets about is really just a response to non-stop jihad. And this brings us to the very much misunderstood Crusades. Now, there was not a single crusade. There are approximately 9 crusades, but most people just lump them all together in order to cast shade on all of them. But the original crusade was a direct response to Islamic aggression. You see, prior to 1095, the Turks began to become the predominant Islamic power, and they were incredibly hostile. And they would murder large swaths of Christians in the area of Asia Minor. Matthew of Odessa, who was a chronicler of that time, records tens of thousands of Christians being massacred with particular sexual cruelty and abuse towards nuns. And even more of them were enslaved. Churches were being desecrated. For example, the city of Ani, which was the capital of Armenia and was known as the city of 1001 churches, every single one of those churches was destroyed by the Islamic Empire. They also sacked at this time the Christian cities of Ephesus, Antioch, and Nicaea. Now, with the Islamic military brutally murdering and enslaving Christians and conquering Christian territory on their way toward Constantinople, which was, again, the gateway into Europe, the Eastern Roman Emperor sends a letter of asking for help to the Bishop of Rome and aid from the West. It was to this that Pope Urban II gathered the leaders of the West and read off all of the atrocities that we've talked about so far tonight and asked the question, who will revenge all this? Who is to repair this damage if you do not do it? Rise up and remember the manly deeds of your ancestors, the prowess of greatness of Charlemagne and his son Louis, and your other kings who destroyed the pagan kingdoms. The unanimous response was Deus Vult, which means God wills it, and the West marched east. As their theme, the first Crusaders read, "Greater love hath no man than this, than a man lay down his life for his friends." You see, the banner of that first crusade was loving God and loving their fellow man. Loving their fellow man by liberating them from Islamic oppression, and loving God by freeing the Holy Land, which was being mocked and desecrated. For example, I talked about Constantine and the building of churches and the Holy Sepulchre all throughout Israel. Well, in 1009 AD, that Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the holiest site in Christianity, was completely destroyed by the Islamic Empire, along with 30,000 other churches in places like Egypt. Now, I want to call out the obvious, which is that the Roman Church also said that this crusade would count toward the remission of sins, which we obviously know is heretical and is not Christianity. And the wrongs of the Crusades are obviously well documented throughout history. But what should be known and remembered is that the original driver of the crusade, if you look at the original sources like Peter the Hermit, was to redress the wrongs done by Islam. So the Crusaders marched with that true cross discovered by Constantine's mom, and under that banner, they went and conquered Jerusalem. Now, this was very short-lived because then 100 years later, Saladin and the Saracens reconquered Jerusalem, and by 1291, the Crusaders were driven from the Holy Land. Now, I want to take a quick moment and talk about fake history. If you've heard of fake news, well, there's also a thing called fake history. And what most of us have been taught about Saracens and Saladin in particular is fake history. See, Saladin is referred to as the chivalrous Muslim or the chivalrous Saracen, and it's portrayed as this noble figure in modern history in books and movies. For example, like in the movie The Kingdom of Heaven, which was a blockbuster film 20 years ago, you'll see Saladin, after conquering Jerusalem, offer free passage for the Christians out of the city, and he's very particular as he's conquered the city to go into a church and pick up a cross and treat it very, very respectfully. Further, in movies like Kingdom of Heaven, Renaud de Chatillon, who was a famous crusader and the Lord of Kirk, is portrayed as one of the most evil men in all of history. This is all fake history. And as a dirty little secret is that most of the modern depictions of Saladin in particular are all based on Sir Walter Scott novels from the 1800s. So what is real? Well, with Renaud, we know that he was known as Islam's most hated enemy. And this is because he sacked Medina and threatened to invade Mecca. Now, at the Battle of Hattin, which preceded the Muslims going back in and conquering Jerusalem, and it happened in 1187 because King Guy of Jerusalem took his army away from water and decided to fight in a desert, and he lost. Well, King Guy and Renaud were captured, and Saladin famously told Guy, "A king does not slay a king." So he turned his animus toward Renaud, and he said, "Your Christ has deceived you. If you do not deny him, he will not be able to free you this day from my hand." To this, Renaud responded, "Christ deceives no man, but that man is deceived who does not believe in him. I adore him. I confess him. I declare his name to you. If you believe in him, you would be able to escape the punishment of eternal damnation, which doubt not has been prepared for you." It's pretty bold. Saladin then, obviously mad, proceeds to behead Renaud. He then commanded 100 of the Knights Templars to be brought before him, and they also were beheaded. Now, this particular act of beheading that Saladin introduced was to basically take the captive, put them on their knees, lean them over, and saw their head off. Now, a few years ago, when you saw ISIS bringing Christians in orange jumpsuits to the beach and beheading them in that particular style, they were emulating this instance in history. Now, the other piece of fake history about Saladin is that he allowed Christians to leave Jerusalem after he conquered it out of the goodness of his heart. That is not true. During the siege, Saladin told the defenders of Jerusalem that he was going to kill all of them. But the Crusaders responded, "Well, if you're going to kill all of us, we are going to burn down Al-Aqsa Mosque, we will burn down the Golden Dome, and we will take the entire city down with us." Well, Saladin said, "No, don't do that. If you will just surrender, we will allow Christians who can purchase their freedom to leave." And this was agreed to. Now, those who couldn't afford to purchase their freedom were not set free, and they were enslaved. Now, Saladin's own chroniclers are the ones who describe this next bit. So again, this is his own people describing what happened to these slaves. And they say, "Women and children came to 8,000 and were quickly divided among us, bringing a smile to Muslim faces at their lamentation. How many well-guarded women were profaned, how many queens were ruled, how many noble girls married, how noble women given away, and miserly women forced to yield themselves, and women who had been kept hidden, these are nuns, stripped of their modesty, and free women occupied," you can fill in that gap, "and precious ones used for hard work, and pretty things put to the test, and virgins dishonored, and proud women deflowered, and happy ones made to weep." That is the real cruel history that you should be aware of. Now, I want to fast forward briefly and discuss the fall of Constantinople. Now, the incredibly militant Ottoman Empire had become the supreme power in the Islamic world. And the Ottomans were particularly cruel because as they would conquer Christian territory, they would take young Christian boys and radicalize them through basically like a Spartan-style fighting upbringing. These Christian boys, now turned jihadi, were called the Janissaries, and they were radical and the brute force that powered the Ottoman army. And I bring this up because when you see the infiltration of Islamic ideology in your public school, this is what they're emulating. Well, in 1453, Muhammad II led his vast army against Constantinople, defended by Emperor Constantine the 11th. Now, after many months of a successful defense, Muhammad II sent out an absolute all-out assault on the city. It is recorded that Muhammad, on the evening before taking the city, rallied his men with the following win-win jihad that originated with that first Muhammad. And he said, as written by the historians, "As it happens in all battles, some of you will die, as it is agreed by fate for each man. Recall the promises of our prophet concerning fallen warriors in the Quran. The man who dies in combat shall be transported bodily to paradise and shall dine with Muhammad in the presence of women, handsome boys, and virgins." Further, they were reminded that they were walking in the footsteps of the companions of the prophet himself who first sieged Constantinople in 674. Again, Islam views itself as one continuous force in history. That same night, Emperor Constantine the 11th made this speech to the Christian defenders. He said, "You know well the hour has come. The enemy of our faith wishes to oppress us. With the entire strength of his siege forth, as a snake about to spew its venom, for this reason, I am imploring you to fight like men with brave souls, as you have from the beginning unto this day against the enemies of our faith." He then led them to the church there, and Constantine and his men partook in communion, and then they went to war. The battle raged, but ultimately the Ottomans had breached the wall and came rushing into the city. It was at this moment that Constantine cried aloud, "The city is lost, but I live." And history then records that he spurred his horse and charged forward into the Ottomans who were coming in their largest numbers. His men followed closely behind him, saying, "Better to die." And history records that Constantine knocked the impious from the walls, and with his sword drawn in his right hand, he killed many opponents while blood was streaming from his legs and his arms. And the final record of the emperor was this, is that the emperor fell and rose again and fell once more. And on May the 29th, 1453, the 2,206-year-old Roman Empire died with him. Simultaneously, Muhammad's prophecy from 632 was fulfilled via Muhammad II. Atrocities that are too difficult to put into words were committed on the survivors of Constantinople. Today, that great city is known as Istanbul, and its great church, Hagia Sophia, has been turned into what's known as the Blue Mosque, and to commemorate Islamic conquest over the West. Now, I want to make this point about Constantinople because it is so incredibly important. It did not have to fall. The West had the resources and it had the armies to defend it, but the Christian West was divided, and so it chose not to. Bartolomeo de Giano, around 1438, defines the time well. He says, "Don't you believe that what I fear could happen, namely by the just judgment of God, this fire, Turkish conquest, shall advance so far that it could occupy the border of Christians? What then are those wretched Christians doing now? What are their princes doing? What are their pastors? What about the pastors of the church? Do they not sleep? Or do they suffer instead from lethargy so that they simply await Christendom to be consumed bit by bit? They play around rather and hurt themselves with lances and dances. And in the meantime, the Turk snuffs out the name of Christ and has already soared and has already vowed himself to his own God not to remain at peace under any agreement unless he hears the praises of Muhammad sung. Oh, where now is Godfrey, Bowman, Baldwin, and the rest of the princes who liberated the sepulchre of Jesus Christ from the hands of the infidel? Where is that noble Charles Martel, king of the Franks?" This is so applicable to us today. The church at large spends so much time fighting itself on secondary and tertiary issues, and it gets picked off one by one to main threats. Consider Constantinople and its demise because Christians could not unite. And juxtapose that with the founding era. This past September 7th was the 251st anniversary of the gathering of that first Continental Congress. Recall that the founders originally met, but they struggled to unite. They couldn't even unite on praying together because of their denominational differences. It was then that Sam Adams stood up and said that I am no bigot and could hear a prayer from any gentleman of piety and virtue who was at the same time a friend to this country. and their choice to unite, even amongst their secondary differences, we know what happens next, and it is our history. Now, does this mean that secondary issues are not important? No, they are important, and they absolutely should be discussed. But when it comes to addressing primary issues and primary threats, like protecting the unborn, our participation should not be dependent on whether someone, for example, believes that the Apostle Paul was the writer of Hebrews. All right, fast forward 200 years, and we're getting close to the end. After Constantinople fell, the seat of the Holy Roman Empire moves to Vienna, Austria. So this was now the target of the Ottoman Empire. This was the heart of Europe. And if it fell, nothing would stop the Islamic Empire from then going down into Italy and conquering Rome and then going all the way to the Atlantic. Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, Kara Mustafa, marshaled the largest army ever to invade Christian territory. Mustafa's army surrounds the city of Vienna, and a message from Mustafa was sent to the defender of Vienna, whose name was Ernst von Starnberg, to submit to Islam and live in peace. Well, Starnberg rejected this offer because it was very well known that Mustafa had gone to other cities before conquering Vienna with these same terms. The moments that the Christians would open the gates and put their guards down, the Ottomans would kill every single one of them. Remember Taqiyya. Well, Vienna had sent out riders prior to the siege to have some sort of help come because they could not defend it on their own, but none came. They were on their own, and on July 1683, the battle for Vienna began. But after 2 months of intense fighting, Vienna was about to fall, and on September 8th, 1683, after an all-out assault from the Ottomans, as they succeeded in capturing the outer wall of the city of Vienna, the remaining 4,000 weary Christian defenders made ready to fight to the death against 200,000 Ottomans. General Starnberg fired distress rockets or flares into the sky, trying to give notice to any Christian army or relief force that may be in the world that it was now or never. Think of the Alamo before it fell. That was the situation. Think of the Titanic sinking in desperation, firing its own flares. The Muslims recognized what this meant, and they roared Allahu Akbar that shook the earth, and history records that the Ottomans implored their deity to, quote, obliterate the infidels utterly from the face of the earth. And what happens next is so incredible that I must read from the account of a witness himself. And it says, after a siege of 60 days, accompanied with 1,000 difficulties, sickness, one of provision, and a great effusion of blood, after 1,000,000 cannon and musket shot, bombs, granados, and all sorts of fireworks, which has changed the face of the fairest and most flourishing city in the world, disfigured and ruined. After a vigorous defense and a resistance without parallel, heaven favorably heard the prayers and tears of a cast down and mournful people. Stromberg's distress rockets were answered by a hail of fireworks that lit up the night sky as the Christian army had come. The King of Poland, John Sobieski, led an army of 65,000 Christian troops, who they stood atop of Kahlenberg Hill, and as they surveyed the beleaguered city and that vast army of 200,000 ready to destroy it, Sobieski turns and says to his men, "It is not a city alone that we have to save, but the whole of Christianity, of which Vienna is the bulwark. The war is a holy one." Mustafa, then in the valley below, in defiance of the oncoming Christian army, ordered all Christian slaves supporting his army, 30,000 individuals, to be murdered, and they were. Sobieski then ordered the largest cavalry charge in all of history. 20,000 Christian horsemen, of whom 3,000 were the hussars, the elite cavalry of the Polish army, known for their eagle wings when they wore into combat, and they charged down the hill, crashing into the Ottoman forces and routing them. And thus ended 1,000 years of Islamic conquest into Europe, as the Ottoman Empire did not recover from this battle and slowly began receding and never became the great military threat that they had been. Now, what is incredibly sad and symbolic of our modern times is over the past year, the city of Vienna rejected allowing a statue of this cavalry charge to be put on that hill that Sobieski and his men came charging down. The concern was that it would create Islamophobia. Now, after Vienna, the Islamic Empire receded, and it shifted its focus and efforts into the slave trade. These Islamic slavers were known as the Barbary pirates. In 1785, these pirates captured 2 American ships and enslaved its crew. The captain of one of these ships was able to write a letter back to the United States, and Thomas Jefferson received it, and in quote, he said, "Our sufferings are beyond our expression or your conception." Thomas Jefferson and John Adams then met with the ambassador of Tripoli to understand, why in the world are you attacking America? We've never done anything to you. The following letter came from John Adams and Thomas Jefferson to record what that conversation was. And they said, "We took the liberty to make some inquiries concerning the grounds of their pretensions to make war upon nations who had done them no injury, and observed that we considered all mankind as our friends, who had done us no wrong, nor had given us any provocation. The ambassador answered us that it was found in the laws of their prophet, that it was written in their Quran, that all nations who should not have acknowledged their authority were sinners, that it was their right and their duty to make war upon them wherever they could be found, and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners, and that every Muslim who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise." Basically, the ambassador just quoted Surah 9:5 at them. Well, Jefferson was ready to go to war right here, but the rest of the United States government was not so fast, and so to avoid a conflict, the United States paid ransom money, which the Islamic chroniclers described it as jizya, which is the tax payment set by the Quran. But after some more attacks on American ships, the U.S. stopped sending jizya payments, and in 1801, they went to war. The Pasha of Tripoli proclaimed jihad on the United States, and the Barbary pirate wars commenced. Now, after 2 separate wars with the Barbary and the creation of the Marines, the U.S. defeated the Islamic pirate nations. This war is commemorated memorably in the Hymn of the Marines as they fight for right and freedom to the shores of Tripoli. Now, during this time, the first American edition of the Quran was printed to help America understand why in the world was it at war with Islam. The printed version of that Quran opened up like this: "This book is a long conference of God, the angels, and Muhammad, which that false prophet very grossly invented. Thou wilt wonder that such absurdities hath infected the better part of the world, and wilt avouch that the knowledge of what is contained in this book will render that law, Sharia, contemptible." Now, one final thing. In the early 1900s, the Islamic Empire came to an end as the Ottomans sided with the Germans in World War I, and they were defeated. And to bring so much of what we talked about full circle, a French general, Henry Girard, after the French had conquered Damascus, went to Saladin's tomb, and he kicked it, and he said, "Awake, Saladin, we have returned. My presence here consecrates the victory of the cross over the crescent." Now, what are we to do with all of this information? Well, as I said at the beginning, those who are ignorant of history are doomed to repeat it. Tomorrow is the 24th anniversary of September 11th. We vowed we would never forget it. We must understand that Islam is an ideology and has been in perfect continuity with itself since its inception. Its methods may change, but its ultimate goal is ultimately to bring the entire world under Dar al-Islam. And it'll do so by any means necessary. The West does not know who it is, and we do not know where we came from anymore, and we continue to be in perfect discontinuity with ourselves. So when we see reports of 125,000 Christians that have been killed and 19,000 churches who have been destroyed in places like Nigeria over the past few years, and thousands more killed in the Congo and in Syria and Yemen and Sudan and Iraq and Afghanistan, the West should know this is not out of nowhere. This is 1,400 years of ideology that must be understood, and it must be rejected. But always remember, Muslims are individuals who need Jesus too. As Christians, Our goal is to make disciples of all nations. The most effective way for us to engage in this historical moment is to evangelize the lost with greater urgency than we ever have in our lives. You've heard about the Epic Islamic Center that's being set up in Plano, Texas. Well, I was listening to an Islamic scholar actually speaking at the Epic Mosque a couple weeks ago, and he said that within one generation, it is very likely that this entire city will be almost half Muslim. He's talking about Plano and the Dallas area. All right, Christian, what is the response? Well, what it should never be is we're finished, or it's over. We can't come back from that. Think of those few Christians in the caves of Spain, or the soldiers defending Vienna. It is never over. God loves to use 300 or so folks to accomplish great works, just like he did with Gideon. So be bold, like the heroes you learned about tonight. Share your faith and witness to these folks with a righteous zeal and love them because Christ loves them. That is our immediate way forward, and that is totally within your control. Take care of what you are supposed to do, and then leave the writing of history to God.